What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are covering the story where the Flash, Wally West, outruns the universe. It's insane. And this is actually a story called The Human Race. Now, this story was written by Grant Morrison. And when it comes to the Flash line of stories, there have been a handful of writers over the years. After Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985, Wally West became the new Flash. And so what you had like Mike Baron, then you had Bill Loeb, then you had Mark Waid, who wrote it for a number of years. And then there was a point where Mark Waid took a break. And what you had was like Grant Morrison, who wrote it for a little while, and then Mark Waid came back for a brief time, and then it was taken over by Jeff Johns. But the whole idea with Grant Morrison's storytelling, it usually follows the form and function of, I want to tell a story that has like a greater purpose. It's basically a commentary on the nature of people or something along those lines. And if the characters have powers, that's cool, and if they don't have powers, that's cool, but I'll just use them however I want to. And so this is one of those stories that's told where it really like elevated the speed of the Flash, in the sense that like, Mike Baron and Bill Loeb, Mark Waid, those guys focus on like the character of Wally West, breaking out of the shadow of Barry Allen, different things like that, how his speed worked, inventing the Speed Force, different things along those lines. Grant Morrison's The Human Race was just, let's see how fast we can make the Flash go. And that's basically what this is. This is, I would argue, probably the fastest point the Flash, any version of the Flash, has ever traveled in the history of DC Comics. Having said that, what this does is it initially picks up with really just like the arrival of a guy who's really just kind of dying, and he's referred to as G-Force, or at least he calls himself G-Force. Now, Wally West showing up here, he's basically met by the arrival, or at least he shows up when there's already like Linda Park and the police and different things like that. Now, but what ends up happening is that with the arrival of G-Force and him basically kind of collapsing, we basically end up having like the arrival of these giant robots, more or less, these giant machines. And all they really say is that we are beings that gamble. And basically, you run, we gamble, that's it. And that's the whole basis behind this. It's basically this idea that this group travels around the cosmos and basically initiates this gigantic race, this race among the fastest beings in existence. And what they do is they effectively tell the entire denizens of Earth, the entire citizenry, you have 24 hours to pick your fastest person, and that person is going to engage in a race. If that person loses the race, or if that person refuses to race, your planet will be destroyed. If that person wins, your planet will be spared. Now, there is a caveat to it, and we'll cover that a little bit more here in a second, but it is really intriguing because what this does is it immediately hits on the idea that the Flash is the fastest man alive, and that's just the way it is. And that was the nature. That's one of the things they say here, is that G-Force, the person who arrived here, had basically failed, and his planet was totally incinerated in its entirety. And so they essentially say, that's the fate that awaits you. Now, from here, it's exactly what we would expect, a meeting with the Justice League of America. But remember, this is kind of intriguing because this is the era of blue and red Superman, more or less. We don't really have to get into that. It's weird. It was basically DC's attempt to try to like reinvigorate the Superman concept following his death and return. It didn't really do too well. People didn't really enjoy it too much. For the most part, they wanted classic Superman, which is what we got. We eventually got classic Superman back. But the Man of Energy was kind of intriguing. But the fact remains, Grant Morrison really plays it close to the vest when it's like the roles superhero plays. The Flash is predicated on the notion of being the fastest man alive. Ergo, if Grant Morrison's writing this story where it's basically a race with the fastest person on Earth, it has to be the Flash. And so that's what ends up happening here. Basically, Wally West signs up and says, okay, the entirety of Earth chooses Wally West, and he immediately races off, travels through this portal, and meets his opponent. And so what we end up finding out is that the opponent of Wally West is actually kind of a fictional friend, or at least it seemed to be an imaginary friend he had when he was younger. What we end up finding out is this imaginary friend was actually real. Now, this friend that Wally has, and it's really kind of interesting, is basically a being made out of radio waves, and it's a being simply called Crackle. But the funny thing about this is that what it does is it essentially says, back when Wally was a kid, before he got his powers, he had a radio that he would talk into, and he would get a response from that radio. And basically, the person on the other end, who he believed to be fictional, would basically tell him about like Radio Land, this place where there's like, radio waves and things that are made of radio waves and all kinds of cool stuff, because it kind of fed into Wally West's love of like the radio industry and how radios worked and different things like that. The long and short of this is that Crackle essentially explains that it's raced against 6 different opponents and it's won every time. I'm sorry, Quiz rather. His raced against 6 different opponents and won every time. And so the question becomes, how in the world can Wally West win facing off against an opponent that's defeated 6 other people? And so this is when we find out the nature of the race. It's not like, some race where they just kind of run across from like Earth to Mars or something like that. They're running throughout the entire, space-time continuum. They're effectively running across across the universe, and they're transitioning into all these different planes and different things like that. But it's insane because when this race kicks off, what ends up happening is the first challenge, quote unquote, they have to face is basically a black hole. And this is a pretty big deal because when it comes to black holes, one of the things that DC kind of keeps intact is the physical properties of a black hole in the real world, in the sense that the gravitational pull is so extreme that light can't escape. I mean, at the end of the day, a black hole is just a collapsed dead star. The long and short of this is that when it comes to the Flash, there's basically, I guess the speed of light is kind of like the upper limit. I mean, a Flash can travel faster than the speed of light, but when they do, they risk entering the Speed Force. And that's the concern that Wally West has. Because light cannot escape a black hole, if he runs at a speed that basically exceeds the speed of light in order to get past, in order to basically make his way, around this black hole, then what it means is that he could potentially enter the Speed Force. Now remember, the way that this is done by Grant Morrison, and even the way it was kind of done by Mark Waid, is a speedster can't really choose to enter the Speed Force. I mean, they kind of can, but in the instance, if they're kind of brushing up against it, like you running alongside a brick wall, the Speed Force will grab them and drag them in, even if they don't want to be there. And that's exactly what happens to Wally. As he's running, he's basically approaching this massive amount of energy, basically the source of where he draws his speed from, and it immediately starts to pull him in. And so where it seems as though he's basically lost to the Speed Force, what ends up happening is we basically have like Quiz that reaches in and grabs him because he's made of radio waves. Now, in truth and historically speaking, this shouldn't be the case. A person who's not a speedster can't just enter into the Speed Force, meaning a person who doesn't draw their energy from the Speed Force can't necessarily enter the Speed Force. The Speed Force is like a giant door, and the only people who have the key to that door are speedsters. And so technically speaking, as far as I'm aware, Quiz shouldn't be able to just like reach into the Speed Force and grab Wally. But because of the fact that he does, he ultimately ends up saving him, yanking him out, and they end up in like the distant past, eons and eons, billions of years into the past, in the early days of the Maltusians. Now, of course, we know the Maltusians basically go on to become the guardians of the universe. But because of the fact that the Maltusians are effectively the first sentient beings in the universe, what this meant is that we are talking about, probably around 7 or 8 billion years in the past. And that's the nature of things. Keep in mind, when it comes to like, the space-time continuum, they're not separate. Space is not separate from time. For example, you have the idea, I think it's, special theory of relativity? The speed of an object is relative to the speed of light. And then general theory of relativity, the speed of object is relative to the speed of light and the impact of everything around it. Space, and when it comes to like, Earth, for example, if I were to take a giant piece of paper towel and I were to sit the Earth on it, or sit like a giant golf ball on it or something like that, it would cause an indentation in that paper towel. That's how, planets and stars impact space. It's more of a fabric than an actual like finite structure. And so because of that, when an object has enough force, it can pull in things around, or enough gravity, it can pull in objects around it, different things like that. And that's the nature of this whole thing. That's the nature of this whole scenario. It's kind of, running back and forth through time, the fact that you can't, travel through time without traveling through space, different things like that. It gets kind of weird and it gets kind of, metaphysically. But the fact remains here that what ends up happening is that with this spanning over the course of about 4 or 5 days, that basically is kind of Grant Morrison skipping over things, in the sense that you end up having like Quiz and you end up having Wally West who continue their race. They kind of race closer to the modern day. Quiz ends up outracing Wally West, gets way ahead, different things like that. But it is kind of wild and it is kind of intriguing because there's one point where it's day 8 and Wally West is running continually to the present day from the distant past. And he actually ends up coming, or at least running through Krypton at the point where it's exploding, which is about 30 years before the modern day. Now, I do want to talk about this for a second. When it comes to DC Comics, for years and years and years, there was no real timeline given in terms of when things happened. It was just somewhere along the line, Krypton exploded, somewhere along the line, Superman landed on Earth, somewhere along the line, Bruce Wayne became Batman. That was really it. There was never really like a chronological order of things in terms of DC saying, here's when it all happened. All this changed in 1993 with 0 Hour Crisis in Time. And what DC did is they basically completed that massive event and then gave us a timeline. They said like, 10 years ago, Superman arrived on Earth. 10 years ago, Bruce Wayne became Batman. And so that's why we get this 30-year window. That's what was established in 0 Hour Crisis in Time. 30 years ago, Krypton blew up. And so it is kind of interesting in terms of like how it ties into the greater DC landscape. But the fact remains that with Wally kind of racing as fast as he can, this is when we find out kind of like the darker side of the race. The way this is done is that if you win, let's say for example that Wally West wins this race, what it would mean is that the planet of Quiz would be totally obliterated and then Wally would have to race again. And he would have to keep on racing until he lost. And when he lost, Earth would be destroyed and the new winner would be forced to race and continue to race until they fail and then their planet is destroyed and a new winner is chosen. And so that's how this whole thing works, that Wally's kind of facing this almost no-win situation in the sense that there's no real conceivable way for him to be able to succeed. Ultimately, he and Earth are going to be destroyed in this great race that goes on. And so what we end up having is Wally finally catching up to Quiz on this kind of a pit stop that has been set up in different locations around the cosmos. And what ends up happening here is Quiz basically says the reason he was able to defeat the 6 other opponents was not purely based on his speed alone. But what we end up finding out is that the energy of a person's home planet, which is to say the kinetic energy put off by the citizens of a home planet running, can basically be siphoned off by Wally West and then used to bolster his own speed. And so this is cool. This is when it gets into the meta commentary of Grant Morrison, because what Grant Morrison basically says is, sure, the Earth has all kinds of problems, but at the end of the day, everybody wants to live. And so because of that, when Wally West just kind of uses the intercom that's been attached to him that allows him to continually communicate with Earth instantaneously, what this means is that it allows him to effectively tell everybody on Earth, everyone has to run. Every single human being out there, every person, regardless of where you come from, regardless of how old you are, if you can run, you have to run, because I can siphon off your energy and I can ensure the survival of our species by basically winning the race and beating Quiz. Now this is kind of cool because the other half of this is that Wally has a genius idea. Wally sits down with these guys and says, okay, so you guys bet. The whole basis of this is that you guys do this to gamble. And so the response of Wally is, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna start a new bet. I will race you all the way back to Earth. And if I get there before you do, you have to spare my planet. And it's kind of cool because what this means is that Wally West is going to travel so astronomically fast, millions of miles, in less than an instant. And that's one thing I want you guys to keep in mind here. And this next little bit that we go over, all this happens in the fractions of a second. You can't even measure it. Snap your fingers right now. And this race happens in less time than that. It's insane. The issue with this is that Wally can't necessarily do it on his own because of the fact, with everybody out there racing, with everybody running, it's still not necessarily fast or enough energy for him to basically siphon it off and make it back to Earth. So what ends up happening is Quiz actually throws his power to Wally West and sacrifices his life in the process. But what it does is it doubles the speed of Wally West. In response to this, what also ends up happening is Superman, Jay Garrick, Impulse, Max Mercury, these various speedsters who were out there also run as fast as they can, bolstering the power of Wally even more. And so in truth, it's not really just Wally's speed on its own that allows him to achieve this insane amount of distance in such a short amount of time. It's really him kind of feeding on the speed of everybody else around him. But remember, this works because one of the big changes that was made to the character of Wally West, one of the big things that was established with him is that unlike other speedsters, he can both gift his speed to other people and take his speed away. Now, other people have been given that power over the years, but Wally was the first one to do it. And so with Wally being able to, siphon off the speed of others or gift others a fraction of his own speed, he basically draws on all this energy that's being sent directly into him and not only makes it back to Earth before one of these, gambling guys does, he makes it back to Earth and actually manages to make his way around Jay Garrick and Superman about 1,000,000 times before they get here. And so it's insane because what ends up happening is we end up also finding out that with Wally West making this race, what he also did is he grabbed the citizens of Quiz's people and brought them to Earth. And so effectively the planet's going to be destroyed, but the planet's completely uninhabited. It doesn't matter. And so the Earth of Wally West has been totally saved. Not only that, he's basically saved this race of people, and then of course gives them a chance to basically find their own world, find a place they can go off to or just reside on Earth or something along those lines. But it's pretty wild and it's pretty insane because it's a crazy amount of speed. So effectively Wally's kind of hailed as like the savior of savior of Earth, more or less. And he's the being who essentially saved everybody in existence. And so the way that this kind of works when it comes to Grant Morrison's stories, what would it be without like a plot twist or something along those lines? What ends up happening is Wally, basically speaking to a class and talking about the nature of what it means to try to save the world and how you always have to kind of persevere and keep on going. He takes a picture with the class. Though when the picture's finished and the people look at it, what we end up finding out is in the background of this picture is the Black Flash watching Wally West. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.